This lecture will cover attitudes and is based on the material covered in Chapter 6 of your textbook. Attitudes. Some questions to consider. What is an attitude? How can it be measured? And what is its link to behavior? What kinds of persuasive messages lead people to change their attitudes? Why do we often change our attitudes as a result of our own actions? The study of attitudes. What are attitudes? An attitude is a positive, negative, or mixed reaction to a person, object, or idea. It's possible to hold conflicting attitudes about the same thing at a conscious and unconscious level. Attitude formation is quick and automatic and often implicit. That means functioning outside of conscious awareness. 4 possible reactions to attitude objects. This chart illustrates the 4 domains, the 4 different reactions we could have to anything, a person, an idea, a thing. As shown, people evaluate objects along both positive and negative dimensions. As a result, our attitudes can be positive, negative, ambivalent, or indifferent. To figure out which one of these attitude domains our reaction might fall into, all we need to do is look at the cross-section between the negative and positive dimensions. So, a positive reaction can run from low to high, just as a negative reaction. If we held a high positive reaction to something but a low negative reaction, that means our overall attitude towards that object would be positive. Similarly, a high negative reaction and a low positive reaction to something would mean that our attitude towards that object would be negative. If we held both a low positive and a low negative reaction to something, we would be indifferent. That means we didn't really care about it. And if our reaction was highly negative and highly positive at the same time, we'd have dual attitudes, or an attitude of ambivalence. And ambivalence describes having mixed or contradictory feelings about one thing. How attitudes are measured. Telling. If we're going to study something, we need to measure it, and that is true for attitudes. But how do we go about measuring attitudes? Well, first, we can just ask people. We can use something called self-report measures. In this case, that would be an attitude scale, a multi-item questionnaire designed to measure a person's attitude towards some object. They would fill out the questionnaire and we'd get all their information about their attitudes on whatever it is we were asking. This is a straightforward, inexpensive, easy way to get a lot of information. The one trouble is that an attitude scale or a self-report measure of an individual's attitude might not capture unconscious or implicit attitudes because those are outside the person's conscious awareness and they may not be able to speak to them. Additionally, an attitude scale, a self-report measure, is subject to deception. And this isn't to say that participants are overtly lying. It's just that if we are trying to measure an uncomfortable attitude, an unpopular attitude, people may be a little reticent to tell us that they endorse that attitude right away. They may want to look good, and so they don't want to tell us that they have this very negative view of something or a belief that's unpopular. As a result, we can sometimes use something called the bogus pipeline. This is a bit of deception, which is relatively commonplace in social psychology and will be disclosed at the end of the experiment, but the bogus pipeline is a phony lie detector device that's sometimes used to get respondents to give truthful answers to sensitive questions. So this can be used in all sorts of ways. We may get creative and hook them up to something, a machine that's not really turned on, and say that that detects lies from truth. We may tell them that part of the scale is really good at telling lies from truth. And think about how this would work. If an individual is already nervous about looking bad, they definitely wouldn't want to look like a liar to researchers, so they're more likely to be honest. How attitudes are measured. Showing. There are other ways to get at people's attitudes without asking them directly. We can use some covert measures. We can videotape people and look at their reactions, their behaviors to things. And this isn't just like kind of reading their behaviors, but do they sit closer to someone, or do they move away from somebody? Do they pick something or not pick something? These can be very good measures of the attitude. And again, we're not asking them directly, we're seeing how they behave. We can also use something called facial-electromyograph, or EMG. This is kind of a high-tech option. It's an electronic instrument that records facial muscle activity associated with emotions and attitudes. And it's quite sensitive, so it can notice just the slightest flinches in muscles that are associated with smiling or frowning or brow furrowing. And that can help us capture the type of emotion an individual is feeling, and we can then correlate that with certain attitudes. Additionally, we can do the same with brain imaging. Certain areas of the brain light up when we're having certain emotional reactions and attitudinal reactions. And again, that can be good data. With both EMG and brain imaging, it would depend on the experiment. And again, these are pretty costly and complicated measures to use, but they can be worth it depending on the study. And finally, there's something called the implicit attitude test. And this is the most popular test for measuring implicit or unconscious attitudes. The facial EMG, a covert measure of attitudes. While we're still researching the use of EMG, there is some interesting data right now that suggests a facial EMG may make it possible for us to detect the difference between positive and negative attitudes. If you direct your attention to the diagram on the right, you'll notice the major facial muscles and recording sites for various electrodes. When people hear a message with which they agree rather than disagree, there's a relative increase in EMG activity in the depressor and zygomatic muscles. So those are the muscles in the lower part of the face. But relative decrease in the coregulator and frontalis muscles. Those are the muscles above the eye. These changes cannot be seen by the naked eye. So early research is showing that the EMG may be able to help detect certain attitudes even when they're not overtly expressed. Measuring implicit attitude. The most used and most famous implicit attitude measure is the Implicit Association Test, or IAT. It's a covert measure of unconscious attitudes derived from the speed at which a person responds to the pairing of concepts, such as black or white, with good or bad. It captures what we call implicit attitudes, which is an attitude such as a prejudice that one is not aware of having. The Implicit Association Test. Here we see an illustration of the Implicit Association Test, or IAT, being used to capture implicit racial attitudes. The IAT is the most commonly used and best known test for capturing implicit attitudes and implicit bias. Here, through a sequence of tasks, the IAT measures implicit racial attitudes, for example, towards African Americans, by measuring how quickly people respond to a black bad, white good word pairing relative to a black good, white bad pairing. Most white Americans are quicker to respond to the first type of pairing than the second, which suggests that they do not as readily connect black good and white bad. It's important to note that the Implicit Association Test is available to take online to absolutely anyone. It's confidential to take it and has been used to capture implicit attitudes about race, gender, age, and physical ability, along with a variety of other constructs. It's also important to note that the implicit attitudes that they're capturing may not be consciously held. So many of these people, for example, in this test, might not consciously feel that they prefer black people to white people or white people to black people, but their responses on the test, because they capture implicit unconscious biases, may differ from the consciously held belief. So what exactly is the IAT? To get a better understanding of the implicit association task and to see how it actually works, please click the link under the heading Understanding the IAT in the description box below. So what are your implicit attitudes? It's important to note that we all have implicit attitudes and implicit bias, and it's really important to recognize that. To get a better understanding of your own implicit attitudes and to help contribute to some wonderful groundbreaking research that has been continuing for over 30 years, please take the implicit attitude test by clicking the link under the heading Take the Implicit Attitude Test in the description box below. Please remember, your participation is confidential. To get a little more background on implicit associations, the IAT, and to hear one of the scientists who discovered this whole construct, please click the link under the heading Testing Our Implicit Associations in the description box below. Please note that this is a podcast and it's about 10 minutes long and is really more of a supplement to your learning. How attitudes are formed. There is evidence that strong likes and dislikes are rooted in our genetic makeup, and this is supported by twin studies, where identical twins who are raised separately are then looked at later on in life, and we see if they end up having similar lifestyles, similar preferences. And there is some evidence that this happens. We've looked at some twins who were separated at birth and then reunited in middle age, and we can see things that are hard to explain. They will have similar haircuts. They may work in similar fields. They may have wives that look the same. It's quite interesting and some good evidence that potentially some of our preferences are hardwired. However, there's also evidence to show that our cherished attitudes are learned, mainly through exposure and operant conditioning. So it makes sense. If I do something new and I have a good experience, I'll be positively reinforced And I'll probably have a positive attitude about that overall. If I meet someone and they are kind to me and that's kind of a positive reinforcement, I will have a positive attitude towards them, and I'll just go through life that way. And of course, the converse is true. If something's negative or I have a bad experience, then I'll have a negative attitude, and that's learned through my exposure to that object. Additionally, our attitudes are influenced by people who are significant in our lives, important people to us. So parents, friends, even enemies can influence our attitudes towards things. We are much more likely to like the things the people we like in our lives like, that's a lot to say, and dislike the same things that people we care about in our lives dislike. And we are much more likely to do the opposite with people we don't like. So for example, if my family really likes a certain type of food, I'm much more likely to like that as well. First of all, I'm exposed to it more often. And then I'm also likely to endorse that sort of as a group unity. Whereas if I meet someone I really dislike, I'm much less likely to take their recommendations for positive things or to heed their negative warnings about things. I'm generally going to try to distance myself from someone I don't like by having opposite attitudes to them. And then separately, our overall social and cultural context can definitely influence our attitudes. This is everything from fashion to what types of TV shows we all watch. You can see those big movements and trends. That's basically all of our attitudes being influenced by the culture we live in. And then on an even broader level, culture definitely influences what we think is normative, our attitudes towards marriage, gender, sexuality, how you raise your children. That is all culturally informed. In general, we engage in something called evaluative conditioning, which also helps us form our attitudes. Evaluative conditioning is the process by which we form an attitude towards a neutral stimulus because of its association with a positive or negative person, place, or thing. So if we associate something with something positive, then we're going to tend to have a positive attitude about this stimulus, which really is pretty neutral. This is used most effectively in advertising. It's why you have celebrities advertising certain items. The goal there is that whatever attitude you have about that celebrity is going to be transferred onto that stimulus. So if some celebrity you have a real positive attitude about holds up a beverage, the hope is that you will transfer that positive idea about the celebrity onto that beverage. You'll learn that too. It'll be conditioned in. You'll associate the two. And while advertising is the most obvious form of evaluative conditioning, we do it all the time. There's so many neutral stimuli in the world, things we don't immediately have a strong feeling about, but through association, we will learn to have a positive or negative association to that neutral stimulus. For an introduction to how attitudes are formed and changed, please click the link under Persuasion, Attitude Change, and the Elaboration Likelihood Model. The link between attitudes and behaviors. Attitudes significantly and substantially predict future behavior. However, certain conditions need to be in place. Attitudes most clearly predict behavior when there's a high correspondence between the attitude measured and the behavior. So if you have a strong attitude or belief about something, it's going to be much more likely that it'll affect the behavior. The attitude has to be strongly held, and decisions are made deliberately, so you have time to make the decision. So you're responding versus reacting. This speaks to something called the theory of planned behavior. The theory of planned behavior is the theory that attitudes towards a specific behavior combine with subjective norms and perceived control to influence a person's actions. Additionally, it's important to note that cultural attitudes about preferences and choice can also influence behavior. For an introduction to the theory of planned behavior, please click the link under the heading, An Introduction to the Theory of Planned Behavior, in the description box below. The theory of planned behavior. Here we can see a diagram that illustrates the theory of planned behavior. It starts on the right and moves to the left. It starts with attitudes, subjective norms, and perceived behavioral control, which combine to influence intentions, and the intentions in turn influence behavior. According to the theory of planned behavior, the attitudes towards a specific behavior combine with subjective norms and perceived behavioral control to influence a person's intentions. These intentions in turn guide but do not completely determine behavior. This theory places the link between attitudes and behaviors within a broader context. Now let's go through this diagram step by step, and let's use an example to give it a bit more context. Say the behavior we want to change is to start eating healthy. The chances that that behavior will occur have to do with our attitudes about eating healthy, the subjective norms in our environment around eating healthy, and the perception we have about controlling eating habits. So for example, if I truly believe eating healthy is important and it's going to affect my life positively and it's something that I need to do, there's a greater chance that's going to inform my intentions ensuring that I eat healthy. However, if I sort of say, I've heard it's a good thing to do, but I don't really think it's that important, or I know it's a good thing to do, but I don't really care, that will probably not feed into an intention to do it and will probably negatively affect the chances that that behavior is going to occur. Additionally, subjective norms play a role. We're very much influenced by our environment. So if I'm around people who are all engaging in eating healthy or believe it's important, that is going to increase my intention to eat healthy. And again, the chances that the behavior will occur. However, if I'm around people who think it's okay, but they eat junk food all the time and are sneaking me junk food and saying it's not that big a deal, it doesn't really matter, that's going to negatively affect the chances that my behavior is going to change. And finally, there's the perception of control. If I feel like I've got this, so say I say, I love junk food, I love sweets, I love McDonald's, but I can definitely control what I put in my mouth. I'm going to make that commitment and I can definitely do this. It's not going to be easy, but I can definitely do this. There's a greater chance that I'm going to be able to eat healthy. Whereas if I say to myself, I have no control over this. Listen, I see McDonald's, I'm going to eat it. It doesn't matter. If I see a donut, I got to eat it. I live with somebody who just cooks junk food all the time. I have no control over what we eat. That is going to decrease the chances that I'm actually going to complete the behavior, that I'm actually going to be able to eat healthy. And again, ideally, we want to have the positive attitude towards the behavior, a subjective norms that support the behavior we're trying to achieve, and real control over our own behavior so that we can achieve this behavior. But sometimes we can still get things accomplished if one is, maybe not as strong as we'd like. So say, for example, I want to eat healthy and I know I can do it because I know I can say no to junk food. But say I live with someone who likes to eat a lot of junk food. There's still a good chance I'm going to be able to eat healthy. The trouble gets to be when we start having 2 and of course 3 of the factors not in favor of the behavior. So again, it's obviously going to be very hard for me to eat healthy if really and truly I don't think it's that important. Everyone around me doesn't really think it's that important and doesn't engage in that behavior. And I think I have no control. The chances that I'm going to end up eating healthy are probably not going to work out. Persuasion by communication. 2 routes to persuasion. Persuasion is the process by which attitudes are changed. And the general consensus is that there are 2 routes to persuasion. This is called the dual process model. The dual process model is a model of persuasion that assumes that we do not always process communication the same way. We do it in one of 2 ways, either using the central route or the peripheral route. The central route to persuasion is the process by which a person thinks carefully about a communication and it's influenced by the strength of its arguments. The peripheral route to the persuasion is the process by which a person does not think carefully about a communication and is influenced instead by superficial cues. Sometimes we describe the dual route of persuasion as the elaboration likelihood model. To learn more about the 2 routes to persuasion, please click the link under the elaboration likelihood model explained in the description box below. The central route. The central route to persuasion describes a person thinking carefully about a communication and being influenced by the strength of its arguments. In the central route to persuasion, neither intelligence nor self-esteem affect a vulnerability to persuasive communication. Here, an individual is engaging in elaboration, and that's the process of thinking about and scrutinizing arguments contained within a persuasive communication. That said, here, an individual may be affected by the self-validation hypothesis. This is a theory that suggests confidence in one's thoughts can increase or decrease persuasion depending on the nature of the thoughts people generate. While the central route to persuasion is rational, it does not guarantee objectivity or that the argument is truthful. The peripheral route. The peripheral route to persuasion describes the instance where a person does not think carefully about the communication and is influenced instead by superficial cues. Here, persuasion is influenced by simple-minded heuristics and attitude embodiment effects. 2 routes to persuasion. How does it really work? Let's take a look at this diagram to compare the process of the 2 routes of persuasion. Based on the aspects of the source message and the audience, recipients of a communication take either a central or peripheral route to persuasion. On the central route, people are influenced by strong arguments and evidence, and on the peripheral route, persuasion is based on heuristics and other superficial cues. This 2-process model helps explain how persuasion seems logical on some occasions and illogical on others. Route selection. So how is a peripheral route determined versus a central route? The route taken depends on whether the recipient of the persuasive message has the ability and the motivation to take the central route. In the absence of either, they will rely on the peripheral cues. In short, if someone can't or doesn't want to take the deeper, more labor-intensive central route, they won't. Which way? The way a recipient processes a persuasive communication depends on three factors: the source, the message, and the audience. The source concerns who is presenting the message. The message concerns what the message says and in what context. And the audience concerns who the message is directed to. The source, who is presenting the message. Our opinion, our view, our attitude about the source has to do with their credibility versus their likability. Of course, this is a continuum, but we're always evaluating whether someone is credible versus likable. Are they more competent and trustworthy, or are they more like us and more attractive? Who do you trust? Please tell me how you would rate the honesty and ethical standards of people in these different fields: very high, high, average, low, or very low. This was the question asked in a December 2004 Gallup poll that was conducted to determine the levels of honesty attributed to people from various occupational groups. Indicated on the chart are the percentage of respondents who rated each group as high or very high in honesty. And we can see that nurses rate the highest, then medical doctors, pharmacists, police officers, clergy members, bankers, lawyers, business executives, advertising practitioners, car salesmen, and finally at the very bottom, members of Congress. What's interesting to note here is that if we were to get a message from any of these people from different occupations, this overall view of whether they were trustworthy would definitely affect our attitudes towards the messages they were giving us. The role of audience involvement. In a study called The Role of Audience Involvement, researchers looked at how different members of the audience listening to the same persuasive argument might react. What they found is that when personally relevant, the recipient is more likely to pay attention and use the central route. So if the argument, the topic is important to you, you're more likely to use the central route. If it's not, you won't. Source versus message, the role of audience involvement. In one study, researchers sought to see the difference between audience members listening to similar persuasive arguments. People who were high or low in their personal involvement to the topic heard a strong or weak message from an expert or a non-expert. For high involvement participants, their results are charted on the left. Persuasion was based on the strength of the argument and not the source of the expertise. For low involvement participants, their results are charted on the right. Persuasion was based more on the source than on the argument. Source characteristics had more impact for those who didn't care enough to take the central route. The sleeper effect. As far as persuasion goes, timing matters, and this is shown by the sleeper effect, which is a delayed increase in the persuasive impact of a non-credible source. The sleeper effect experiments. Here we see the results of two experiments which illustrate the sleeper effect. In experiment 1, shown on the left-hand side, participants changed their immediate attitudes more in response to a message from a high credibility source than a low credibility source. The high credibility source is the line in blue, and the low credibility source is the line in pink. However, when attitudes were measured 3 weeks later, the high credibility source had lost its impact. You can see that slope on the blue line, and the low credibility source had gained impact. You can see that pink line kind of rising a bit. And this is the sleeper effect. In experiment 2, which is shown by the line graph on the right-hand side, the sleeper effect disappeared when the participants were reminded of the source. This effect occurs reliably when subjects learn about the source after they receive a persuasive message. To learn more about the sleeper effect, please click the link under the heading Sleeper Effect in the description box below. The sleeper effect actually occurs a great deal in our everyday lives, especially when we're talking about advertisements and media. To learn how the sleeper effect influences your attitudes and beliefs, please click the link under The Sleeper Effect, The Power of the Media in the description box below. The message. What the message says and in what context. The persuasiveness of the message is influenced by information strategies, message discrepancies, fear appeals, positive emotions, and subliminal messages. Informational strategies. The most effective strategy depends on whether the audience uses the peripheral or the central route. This can be different depending on which route of persuasion the audience is going to use. So for example, in terms of length of communication, if the message is being processed through the central route of persuasion, the quality of the argument is more important than the length. However, if the message is being processed through the peripheral route of persuasion, people often fall back on the heuristic that the longer the message, the more valid it must be. So length becomes more persuasive than the quality of the argument. Additionally, when we're looking at informational strategies, we want to look at the primacy versus the recency effect, because time is a critical factor in persuasion. The effects of presentation order and timing on persuasion. If you have to give an opposing argument, persuade someone when someone else is arguing the other side of the same topic, say, for example, in a debate, do you want to go first or do you want to go second? There's a lot of conventional wisdom around this. Some people say you want to go first to be the first thing people hear. Some people say they want to go second so they leave everybody thinking about their argument. So which one is right? The truth is it's not that simple because it also depends on timing. In a study by Miller and Campbell, they demonstrated the effect of presentation order and timing of opposing arguments on persuasion. They did this by looking at 4 different conditions. In the first condition, they had message 1 and message 2 presented one after the other. They then asked participants to wait a week and then had them come back and ask their decision. And it appeared that they had been influenced more by the first argument they'd heard, or that the primacy effect had worked. They'd been more influenced by the first thing they heard. The second condition, they had participants come in and listen to message 1, then wait a week, and then listen to message 2, and then they immediately asked the participants for their decision. In this instance, we saw the recency effect. That is, that participants were more influenced by the second message, the most recent message that they'd heard. In the third condition, they had participants come in and listen to message 1 and message 2 right after each other, and then had them make an immediate decision. In this condition, there were no primacy or recency effects. Similarly, in condition 4, they had participants come in and listen to message 1, then wait a week, come in and listen to message 2, wait another week, and then they asked for their decision. Here again, there were no primacy or recency effects. Message discrepancy. When we are trying to convince or persuade someone, by definition, they don't hold the same point of view that we do. So how strong an argument should we make? How discrepant, how different should a message be from the audience's existing position? It's important here to exercise caution, because if we come in with too strong a message, too strong an argument, or too much passion, we can be rejected outright without anyone listening to us. As a result, it makes a bit of sense to temper our message, to at least get the person to listen a little bit so that there's a greater chance that the message will take the central route. Furthermore, we have to get a better sense of how important this argument is to the person we're speaking to, because the more personally important an issue is, the more resistant to change the message recipient will be. Fear appeals. Fear is effective, but its influence is not universal. Certain conditions need to be in place for it to work. Strong fear appeals can be highly effective if the message also provides clear and reassuring advice about how to cope with threatened danger. Fear can work if I give you some advice on what to do with that fear. However, if I don't, fear doesn't work, because in the absence of clear instructions for coping, people feel helpless, they panic, and they tune out the message. Positive emotions. Positive emotions make it more likely that we'll be persuaded, even if our consideration of the argument isn't particularly profound. When people are in a good mood, they are more agreeable, more open to persuasion, more sociable, more generous, their outlook is more positive, and they are more decisive, but with relatively little thought. In short, positive emotions activate the peripheral route. As a result, we're more likely to be persuaded when we're in a good mood. Subliminal messages. Subliminal messages are messages that are outside of our conscious awareness, and the power of subliminal messages has been over-amplified in the culture for a very long time. People speak about hidden messages in music or advertisements or even in images. However, controlled experiments using subliminal messages show that there are no therapeutic benefits to subliminal messages. And while people may respond to subliminal cues in the short term, they only do this when they are already motivated to take the action. Subliminal influence. Here we see the results of an experiment that illustrate how subliminal influence works. Thirsty and non-thirsty research participants were subliminally exposed to neutral or thirst-related words. Afterwards, they participated in a beverage taste test in which the amount they drank was measured. We can see the results in the graph on the left-hand side of your screen. The two bars all the way on the left represent individuals who were in the thirsty condition, and the two bars on the right are research participants who were not thirsty. The amount of liquid consumed by individuals who received thirst-priming words is represented in aqua, and the amount of liquid consumed by individuals who received neutral words is represented by those green bars. You can see that the subliminal thirst cues had little impact on the non-thirsty participants. There's a slight difference in the bars, but it wasn't statistically significant. However, when you look at the left-hand side of that bar chart, you can see that the thirst prime words significantly increased the consumption of those who were already thirsty. So apparently subliminal cues can influence our behavior when we are otherwise predisposed. That is to say, if we already have the start of that certain behavior, the subliminal influence can push it even further. Need for cognition. To whom is the message directed? One of the factors that influences the root of persuasion is need for cognition. Need for cognition, or NC, is a personality variable that distinguishes people on the basis of how much they enjoy effortful cognitive activities. As you've probably guessed, individuals with a high need for cognition are more likely to take the central route to persuasion, whereas individuals with low need for cognition are more susceptible to the peripheral route of persuasion. Need for cognition, sample items. Sometimes it's easier to show rather than tell. So as we grapple with this concept of need for cognition, let's look at a few of the items from the self-report measure used to assess an individual's need for cognition. As I read through this list, think about each statement and whether or not it applies to you. 1. I really enjoy a task that involves coming up with new solutions to problems. 2. Thinking is not my idea of fun. 3. The notion of thinking is appealing to me. 4. I like tasks that require little thought once I've learned them. 5. I usually end up deliberating about issues even when they do not affect me personally. 6. It's enough for me that something gets the job done. I don't care how or why it works. So are you high or low in need for cognition? Chances are, if you agree with items 1, 3, and 5 and disagree with items 2, 4, and 6, you'd probably be regarded as an individual who has high need for cognition. The type of audience. The type of audience definitely influences what type of persuasion might work. And here we're speaking less about central and peripheral. Perhaps we're only speaking about peripheral, and it's about how the audience feels about the message. One group is called self-monitoring. These are individuals who regulate their own behavior across situations due to concerns for public self-presentation. As a result, they tend to be more susceptible to image-focused arguments. These are individuals who are more likely to pay more for a certain type of beer or a certain type of clothing, again, to maintain a certain image. Then there's a group that are concerned with regulatory fit. As a result, they're drawn to a type of persuasion that feels right. So it's less about the message and more about how it makes them feel. As a result, they may be more promotion-oriented, so drawn to the pursuit of success, versus prevention-oriented, who are maybe drawn into messages about fear and protection. Here, a positive versus negative feel or vibe about the message, about the persuasion, is the most important. Forewarning and resistance. So how do people defend against persuasion? What keeps people from changing their mind, or how can they keep from having their mind changed? Here we're going to talk about the inoculation hypothesis and psychological reactance. The inoculation hypothesis is the idea that exposure to weak versions of a persuasive argument increases the latter's resistance to the argument. It's the psychological version of vaccination. Basically, a small amount of the argument or a weak bit of the argument can make you better able to resist the full force of the argument when it comes later. Psychological reactance. Psychological reactance is the theory that people react against threats to their freedom by asserting themselves and perceiving the threatened freedom as more attractive. This is essentially what's happening during something called reverse psychology. So when it seems like we don't have a choice, we will react more strongly, and the thing we're told not to do, the thing that's been cut off, is the thing we want the most. So how does the inoculation theory actually work? To learn more about the inoculation theory, click the link under Inoculation Theory and how it fits in the description box below. So how does psychological reactance theory work? To learn about psychological reactance theory, please click the link under the heading, How does reverse psychology work, in the description box below. Strategies for resisting persuasion. We resist persuasion all the time, and there are a number of strategies that we engage in. Here we'll walk through a few strategies and show an example of what that might look like. Think about which strategies you use. There's attitude bolstering, where you build up the existing attitude. I assure myself of the facts and support the validity of my belief. There's counter-arguing, where you play devil's advocate. I would talk to myself and play devil's advocate. And in a sense, you build up your own argument by examining the holes in it and coming up with your own arguments for it. Social validation. That's when you look for support from everyone around you. I would rely on others with the same opinion to be there for me. So if I'm like everyone else, then obviously my attitude, my opinion, it's in good company and it's supported. Negative affect. I tend to get angry when someone tries to change my beliefs. Again, if you're going to get grumpy anytime anyone talks to you, people are probably not going to try to persuade you. Assertions of confidence. I doubt anybody could change my viewpoint. I think if you put up this idea that your attitude is unchangeable, people may not try to persuade you. Selective exposure. Most of the time, I just ignore them. So again, if you're not listening, it's very hard to persuade you. Source derogation. I look for faults in the person presenting the challenging belief. So this is where you go after whoever is giving the challenging belief. Here again, that will keep you from being persuaded. All of these are good strategies for keeping from being persuaded. They may not be great social strategies, though, for making friends. Either way, these are many ways people use in order to keep from being persuaded. Culture and persuasion. To be persuasive, a message should also appeal to the audience's culture. And this is different depending on which culture or which type of culture you come from. In individualistic cultures, persuasive messages focus on personal beliefs, individuality, competition, and self-improvement. In collective cultures, persuasive messages focus on integrity, achievement, and well-being of one's in-group. By appealing to what is held to be important in these cultures, messages can be more persuasive. For a review on persuasion, please click the link under How Ads and People Persuade You in the description box below. Persuasion by our own actions. Role-playing. All the world's a stage. Have you ever heard about fake it till you make it? The idea that if you play the role of someone who has a certain attitude, who believes a certain thing, you'll eventually come to believe it yourself? Well, beyond being a cute little piece of rhyming advice, there does seem to be some evidence that it's possible. When we play along, saying and doing things that are privately discrepant from our own attitudes, do we begin to change those attitudes as a result? Role-playing support for an attitude discrepant position can persuade people to accept the position, especially if they have come up with the supporting arguments for the role play. In the end, it seems like there's a bit of a self-generated persuasion effect, that we can persuade ourselves with a good enough argument. Sometimes we don't even have to go all the way through with the role play. Even expecting to have to communicate a message can produce an enduring attitude change. Cognitive dissonance theory, the classic version. Cognitive dissonance theory is a theory that holding inconsistent cognitions arouses psychological tension that people become motivated to reduce. The conditions for cognitive dissonance theory are as follows. The attitude discrepant behavior has to be chosen freely with some knowledge of the consequences. If we are forced into that behavior, it's not our responsibility, and we do not experience the psychological arousal and tension. What is cognitive dissonance? To get a better understanding of cognitive dissonance, please click the link under Cognitive Dissonance Theory in the description box below. Ways to reduce dissonance. Remember that cognitive dissonance describes a state where an individual freely engages in attitude discrepant behavior with full knowledge of the consequences. This leaves us in a state of psychological tension because our behaviors and our attitudes are in opposition. So for example, if I'm telling myself I need to be on a diet and yet I dive headfirst into a tub of chocolate fudge brownie ice cream, I'll be in a state of psychological tension or cognitive dissonance because my attitudes and my behaviors are in direct opposition and I need in some way to resolve this. I can do this through a number of techniques. One of them is to change my attitude. I can say to myself, I don't really need to be on a diet. The second is to change my perception of the behavior. I can sort of lie to myself and say, I didn't really eat that much ice cream. It wasn't that bad. I can also add consonant cognitions or alter my thinking about this and say, chocolate ice cream is very nutritious. I can talk about, oh, it's got antioxidants and calcium. I might also minimize the importance of the conflict overall by saying something like, well, you know what? I don't actually need to diet. I don't care. I don't care if I'm overweight. Life is short. And finally, I can also reduce the perception that I had a choice. Again, remember, if the behavior was not engaged in freely, cognitive dissonance doesn't occur. So I can say something like, I had no choice. The ice cream was served for a special occasion, or, it was going to melt or something like that. If it's out of my control, then I will experience a lower level of cognitive dissonance. Justifying attitude discrepant behavior when doing is believing. Cognitive dissonance and attitude change are more likely to occur when there is insufficient justification or insufficient deterrence for the attitude discrepant behavior. Insufficient justification is a condition in which people freely perform an attitude discrepant behavior without receiving a large reward. Insufficient deterrence is a condition in which people refrain from engaging in desirable activity even when only mild punishment is threatened. These conditions were shown in a classic experiment of cognitive dissonance done by Festinger and Carl Smith in 1959. The dissonance classic. Now let's look at the results from the classic experiment conducted by Festinger and Carl Smith, which discovered the phenomenon of cognitive dissonance. In this experiment, participants were brought in the lab and were asked to complete extremely boring, extremely tedious tasks, which they believed were part of an experiment. As they were getting ready to leave, the actual experimental conditions began. Participants were divided into 3 groups, and each were asked to speak to a fellow student about participating in the experiment. One group was allowed to say whatever they wanted, and the other 2 groups were asked to lie. In the 2 groups that were asked to lie, there were 2 different conditions. One group was paid $20 to lie, while the other group was paid $1 to lie. A little bit later, all participants were asked to rate how much they enjoyed the experiment. Not surprisingly, members of the group who did not have to lie admitted that the task was boring. The members who were paid $20 to lie also stated that the task was boring. It appears that $20 was ample justification for them to lie to somebody else. However, interestingly enough, participants who were paid only $1 rated the task as more enjoyable. You can see the results on the right-hand side of your screen. Again, individuals who didn't have to lie and individuals who were paid rated the task at low enjoyment, whereas individuals paid only $1 to lie rated the task as having the highest level of enjoyment. Here it seems that behaving in an attitude discrepant manner without justification, that $1 really wasn't enough justification for lying to that other person. These later participants reduced their dissonance by changing their attitude about the experiment. Justifying effort, coming to like what we suffer for. One example of cognitive dissonance theory in everyday life is the fact that we alter our attitudes to justify our suffering. The more time or money or effort you choose to invest in something, the more anxious you will feel if the outcome proves disappointing. This was proven by an experiment done by Aaron and Mills. In it, they had female students all participate in an initiation task to get into a certain type of discussion group. One group listened to some boring lectures on birds, while another group listened to highly explicit sexual material. And again, remember, this was 1959. So one group was put in a very embarrassing condition and the other was put in basically a neutral condition. Following this, they were all admitted into the discussion group. And while the discussion group was pretty regular and pretty boring, individuals who'd been in the embarrassment condition rated the group as much better than those who had not. In essence, they had to resolve that dissonance of going through something horrible in their mind to get to something boring. So they resolved that by making the thing more interesting, by changing their attitude about the final outcome. We see this a lot of the times around things like hazing, for example. Whenever an individual is joining a group and there's a hazing where they put you through embarrassing and horrible tasks to kind of earn your membership in the group, individuals tend to view membership in the group as much more valuable because of the embarrassment, the difficulty, the struggle they had to go through to get there. Justifying difficult decisions when good choices get even better. Another example of cognitive dissonance in the real world is when we have to make a tough decision. After making a difficult decision, people rationalize the decision by exaggerating the positive features of the chosen alternative and the negative features of the unchosen alternative. Again, sometimes our decisions don't have extreme differences between the alternatives, and we go through a good deal, though, to choose between them. And if we've gone through a very difficult, emotionally taxing decision to arrive at an alternative that is just okay or just so, that can cause cognitive dissonance. And again, we resolve it by making the difference between the two alternatives more extreme, by making what we've chosen much more positive, and then by making what we've not chosen more negative. Again, this resolves that cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance theory, a new look. Following research by Cooper and Fazio in 1984, we've come up with 4 steps that are required to arouse or reduce cognitive dissonance. The first is that attitude-discrepant behavior must produce unwanted negative consequences. This is pretty straightforward. The behavior that we engage in that's attitude-discrepant has to actually make something negative happen. Something bad has to happen. There must be a feeling of personal responsibility in the unpleasant outcomes of behavior. So again, for cognitive dissonance to occur, those negative unpleasant outcomes must feel like I've caused them, like there are personal consequences to the behavior choice. There must be physiological arousal that produces a state of discomfort and tension that a person seeks to reduce. This is a relatively new factor that's introduced, that it's actually physically uncomfortable to tolerate this tension. And finally, a person must attribute the arousal to the attitude-discrepant behavior. So again, I have to connect my physiological arousal, my discomfort, to the fact that I made that choice to behave in an attitude-discrepant fashion. Dissonance conditions, the process. Research suggests that 4 steps are necessary for attitude change to result from the production and reduction of dissonance. We can see this charted out here from the left to the right-hand side of the screen. To understand this better, let's take a look at it step by step, and we'll use the example of eating all that ice cream when we said we were going to eat healthy. So that's the behavior. I eat a tub of ice cream when I promised myself I was going to eat healthy. After I do this, we're going to see the antecedent conditions that produce discomfort. So the starting conditions that make me uncomfortable initially. First, step 1, I must experience some type of negative consequence. That could be a feeling of guilt. That might be a feeling of a bit of physical discomfort because I'm full of ice cream, something like that. I have to feel an unwanted negative consequence. That can be emotional or physical. Then step 2, I need to feel personal responsibility. I need to recognize that I ate the ice cream and that's why I feel uncomfortable. I feel physically uncomfortable. I feel guilty. It's because I ate the ice cream. I need to recognize that that's due to my behavior. Then we move to step 3. Recognizing that this attitude-discrepant behavior is my responsibility may make me feel anxious, psychologically and physiologically aroused. I may get a bit upset, nervous. My heart may race just a little bit because I'm uncomfortable with what I've done. Then I have to attribute the arousal to my previous behavior. So it isn't just that my heart's beating fast because, I don't know, I've run from the kitchen to the living room, or anything like that. I have to recognize that this physiological arousal, this nervousness, this tension is due to the fact that I engaged in an attitude discrepant behavior fully willingly, and it's my responsibility, or in some cases I might say my fault. And when I attribute that physiological arousal to the attitude discrepant behavior, I need to do something because I'm now responsible for doing something that's made me so upset. This is when we move to attitude change, to resolve that dissonance, to resolve the discomfort of knowing I did something in my own free will that is discrepant to an attitude I hold. I need to somehow resolve it. And that generally results in an attitude change. So I may say something like, you can't eat healthy every day. You deserved it. It wasn't that much ice cream. You don't need to be on a diet. Curvy girls are in. Whatever it is, I will change my attitude in order to resolve that internal and, to a certain extent, physiological tension. Alternative routes to self-persuasion. While cognitive dissonance is the most commonly used theory to explain self-persuasion and self-motivated shifts in attitude, there are other theories that seek to explain this. There are self-perception theory, impression management theories, and self-esteem theories, the main one being self-affirmation theory. In self-perception theory, we infer how we feel by observing ourselves and the circumstances of our own behavior. So jumping back to the example of eating a tub of ice cream when we were supposed to be on a diet, self-perception theory might cause me to look at the entire situation and re-explain my behavior to resolve any anxiety that I have. So I might say, you didn't really eat dinner or lunch that day, so you were probably really hungry. Or maybe I had a tough day at work and I'll say, you really just needed that ice cream, that treat for yourself. And that helps me resolve the dissonance. In impression management theory, the issue here is not whether or not the motive's consistent, but that it appear consistent. So while I may not fully believe this, I may tell myself, you know what? You're a person who knows how to take care of yourself. And generally that's eating healthy, but on this day you needed that ice cream. Or you know what your body needs. And usually your body needs healthy food, but that day your body needed, a treat. I may not fully believe that, but I'm able to, on some level, make everything appear consistent. And finally, there are self-esteem theories. And in self-esteem theories, acts that arouse dissonance do so because they threaten self-concept. And so to resolve the dissonance, we don't necessarily have to act on that specific behavior. We just need to, in some way, reaffirm the self-concept. So I may be able to reduce the dissonance by promising myself that I'm going to work out tomorrow because I am identifying myself as someone who really is healthy, and this was an unhealthy act, and perhaps being healthy in another area of my life by promising to work out the next day, or, immediately going and doing a bit of yoga or something like that will rehabilitate my self-esteem and again, make me feel a little bit better and resolve the dissonance. Theories of self-persuasion, critical comparisons. Now let's compare the four theories of self-persuasion: cognitive dissonance, self-perception, impression management, and self-affirmation. You'll recall that self-affirmation is the most commonly discussed theory of the self-esteem theories and self-persuasion. We will compare the latter four theories, self-perception, impression management, and self-affirmation, to cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is the foundational theory in this area, and it's the theory to which all others will be compared, and it's the theory that is being complicated by all of these later theories. To start, let's review the qualities of cognitive dissonance. In cognitive dissonance, the attitude change is motivated by the desire to reduce discomfort. In cognitive dissonance, the person's private attitude really changes. And in cognitive dissonance, the change must be clearly related to the attitude discrepant behavior. Now we're going to compare the other major theories of self-persuasion. Each alternative challenges a different aspect of cognitive dissonance. In self-perception theory, they assume that the attitude change is a matter of inference, not motivation. In impression management theory, they maintain that the change is more apparent than real, reported for the sake of public self-presentation. And finally, self-affirmation theory contends that the motivating force is a concern for self, and that the attitude change will not occur when the self-concept is affirmed in other ways. Ethical dissonance. Ethical dissonance is a feature of behavioral ethics, and behavioral ethics is the study of how individuals behave when facing temptations to cheat, steal, plagiarize, commit fraud, or otherwise behave unethically. There are two types of problems that have to be addressed: intentional lapses in ethics and acts of intentional wrongdoing committed to serve personal interests. The violation of one's personal moral code. Violating one's personal moral code threatens self-esteem and arouses inner turmoil. Similar to the turmoil we feel in cognitive dissonance, the discrepancy between what we believe we should do and what we actually do can be uncomfortable. It can cause psychological and physiological stress. In order to resolve this turmoil, we will tend to engage in pre-violation justifications and or post-violation justifications. A pre-violation justification is a justification that allows us to continue and engage in the violation. A post-violation justification excuses the violation. These can be things like shifting blame. Well, it's not really my fault. It's because so-and-so did this. Rationalizing, well, I had to do it because, and XYZ. Confessing and apologizing and offering compensation, so being extremely sorry. There is a saying that it's easier to apologize than to ask for permission. That's an example of post-violation justification. And then we also may distance ourselves from the misdeed by asserting ethical standards for the future and judging other transgressors more harshly. So we'll say, well, mine wasn't that bad as this person, and also in the future, we should probably do it this way. All of these things make it easier to tolerate the fact that we violated our own moral code. Now let's take a look at justifications, and you can see them charted out here on this diagram. It starts off with the tempting situation, and if we follow the top line, we'll engage in a pre-violation justification where we will come up with some reason that makes this violation of our moral code okay, and then we can continue on, we can engage in the violation, and we've maintained our self-concept. If we follow the bottom line where we engage in the moral violation, we might either have to sit in a position where our moral self-concept is threatened. That is uncomfortable and probably not what we're going to do. So after a violation, we'll engage in post-violation justifications. This could be apologizing profusely, reorganizing the behavior so we shift blame to somebody else or we rationalize it away. And as a result of justifying it, we are able to maintain our self-concept. Self-affirmation. Self-affirmation is a practice that revalidates the integrity of self-concept. Self-validation helps to offset dissonance of engaging in attitude-discrepant behavior. Notably, revalidation does not require the resolving of dissonance. It can be achieved by other acts that reaffirm the self-concept. Revalidating the self-concept relieves the effects of dissonance and protects against threats to self. So jumping back one more time to that example of eating that fudge ice cream when I'm supposed to be on a diet, an act of self-affirmation there might be to just say, it happens. It's just one time. You're still someone that takes good care of yourself. You're still someone that's trying to eat healthy. This just happened. That can relieve the dissonance of the attitude discrepant behavior of having that big high-calorie snack on a diet. Additionally, it also protects my self-concept going forward. One mistake does not throw out all of the other work that I've put in. One tub of ice cream doesn't make me someone who isn't healthy. And that's really important because, again, it protects against future attacks to the self-esteem while resolving the dissonance in the moment. Cultural influences on cognitive dissonance. Cultural context may influence both arousal and reduction of cognitive dissonance. However, it may be around different things. In Western individualistic cultures, decisions are expected to be consistent with personal attitudes, while in East Asian collectivist cultures, decisions are expected to benefit the in-group. Post-decision justification effect occurs in both groups, but the conditions that produce this effect vary by culture. Cognitive dissonance is both universal and culturally dependent. Here we see the results of a study where researchers compared cognitive dissonance in Western participants and East Asian participants. Researchers compared Canadian and Japanese research participants in a post-decision dissonance study in which they ranked ordered items on a menu and chose their top dishes and then ranked the list again. Half made choices for themselves and the other half were asked to imagine a chosen friend who they knew a good deal about. When deciding for themselves, only Canadians exhibited a self-justification effect, and when deciding for a friend, however, Japanese participants exhibited a stronger effect. So here we see that justification for the views that the culture holds, that push to resolve the dissonance towards the cultural held belief. Individualistic cultures are in the West and collectivist cultures are in the Far East. As a result, Canadians are more likely to justify their individualized behavior, and Japanese participants are more likely to justify their collectivist behaviors. Here we see that cognitive dissonance does occur in everyone, but how it occurs and when it occurs is dependent on cultural norms. Changing attitudes. Changing attitudes. So how do attitudes change? Well, there are two major ways. First, there's persuasion by others, and as we've discussed, that runs along two routes. The central route to persuasion is attitude change that's based on the merits of the source and the communication. Then there's peripheral routes to attitude change. That's attitude change based on superficial cues. And finally, attitude change comes from the self, and attitude change can occur when people attempt to reconcile their attitudes with behaviors that are inconsistent with those attitudes. This concludes our discussion of attitudes. In our next lecture, we'll discuss conformity, and that will be based on information in Chapter 7 of your textbook.